When we think of the Middle Ages, we imagine knights in shining armor, Gothic cathedrals, and monks bent over their manuscripts. But if you stepped into a medieval town, you'd also find another institution, less glorious, but very real, the brothel. Far from being hidden in dark alleys, brothels were often official, regulated and taxed by both civic and church authorities. They were a paradox of medieval life, condemned in sermons, but defended as a necessary evil in law. Let's start with the most famous example, the Bankside stews of London. From at least the 12th century, prostitution in Suffolk was under the direct control of the Bishop of Winchester. The women who worked there were mockingly called Winchester geese. The bishop's estate collected rents and fines from the brothels, which sat right across the Thames from the City of London, within walking distance of St. Paul's Cathedral. The hypocrisy was so glaring that medieval writers mocked it openly. A proverb of the time joked, "He prays with his mouth and pays with his purse." Now, here's a fun fact. Because these women were excluded from consecrated burial grounds, local tradition holds that they were buried in a special cemetery in Suffolk known as Cross Bones. Archaeological digs there in the 1990s uncovered thousands of skeletons, many of women and children, dated roughly to the 12th to 17th centuries. The site has since become a symbol of the forgotten and outcast of medieval society. But England wasn't unique. Across the Channel, municipal brothels were common. In Strasbourg, the Frauenhaus or Women's House was run directly by the city council. Officials set prices, inspected the premises, and even recorded how much money was being made. In many German towns, brothel accounts survive in the archives, showing daily takings and expenses, evidence that civic leaders treated prostitution like any other taxable trade. Why would respectable governments support such places? The answer lies in medieval moral theory. Thinkers like St. Augustine argued centuries earlier that prostitution was regrettable but socially necessary. Suppress it completely, they warned, and greater sins, like adultery, rape, or sodomy, would flourish. City leaders absorbed this logic. In their eyes, a regulated brothel was a way to contain lust, channel it, and profit from it. One 15th century town council bluntly stated that brothels were for the health of the city. And here's another fun fact. Some of the regulations read like proto-customer service rules. In certain towns, men who refused to pay could be dragged before a magistrate. In Cologne, fines were imposed on clients who became violent. In some Italian cities, authorities fixed a maximum price of services to prevent exploitation, and women could take customers to court over unpaid debts. What about the women themselves? Evidence shows most were young, unmarried, and poor. Many came from the countryside, drawn to the city by the promise or illusion of work. Some were former domestic servants or widows with no other means of support. A few found limited autonomy in the trade. In Augsburg, records show some sex workers became brothel keepers themselves, renting rooms and employing others. But make no mistake, the life was often short and brutal. Venereal disease, already present before syphilis exploded in the late 15th century, was common. So were beatings, social stigma, and poverty. And the rules of dress? These are some of the strangest and most humiliating medieval laws. Cities loved sumptuary laws, rules telling people what they could wear. Prostitutes were singled out with forced markers. striped hoods in England, yellow veils in Florence, or specific colored ribbons in parts of France. In Vienna, they had to wear a blue headscarf. The idea was to make them instantly recognizable in public, even outside the brothel. At the same time, they were forbidden from wearing jewelry, silk, or rich fur, the symbols of respectable wives and daughters. These rules weren't just practical, they were meant to enforce shame. Now, let's step inside. Forget the romantic visions from films. A medieval brothel was more like a noisy tavern with bedrooms attached. Many had a common hall with tables for drinking, dice, and music designed to loosen up customers. The private rooms were tiny, often just wooden cubicles with straw mattresses, thin partitions, and curtains instead of doors. In towns with bathhouses, brothels sometimes combined bathing and sex. So imagine tubs of steaming water, strong wine, and rowdy singing in a smoky chamber. Brothels even had curfews. In Paris, for example, they were supposed to shut their doors at nightfall, though that rule was often ignored. Some places closed on Sundays and feast days, and most shut down completely during Lent. In London, the Bankside stews had an official list of regulations dating back to 1161 under Henry II, an astonishingly early attempt to codify the sex trade. Among the rules, women could not take their customers' clothes in pawn, could not harbor thieves, and were not allowed to keep their own husbands inside the house. But here's one of the biggest contradictions. The very people who denounced prostitution were also some of its best customers. Records show priests, monks, and even bishops visiting brothels. In the university towns of Paris and Oxford, students were infamous for their trips to the stews, and kings were hardly innocent. King Edward III of England was accused of tolerating the trade in London because it brought in revenue. Later, during the reign of Henry VIII, the Bankside stews were finally closed, not for moral reasons, but because of the spread of syphilis. Speaking of disease, here's a chilling fun fact. The arrival of syphilis around 1495 devastated Europe's sex industry. Cities that once regulated brothels began closing them one by one. Doctors called it the Great Pox, and it was far deadlier in its first centuries than today. Suddenly, the lesser evil of prostitution looked like a plague risk. Combined with a new wave of religious reform movements, the preaching of Savonarola in Florence, the rise of Protestant reformers, and the stricter Catholic Counter-Reformation, municipal brothels vanished from civic ledgers. So what's the takeaway? Medieval brothels weren't hidden dens of sin. They were semi-public institutions woven into the fabric of city life. They reveal the contradictions of the age, a society that publicly condemned lust, but privately organized it, a church that preached chastity, but collected rent from the stews, and city leaders who treated women's bodies as tools of both order and profit. When you walk past a Gothic cathedral today, remember that just a few streets away once stood places equally important to the medieval urban landscape. The brothel wasn't an aberration, it was part of the system. And its history tells us more about medieval attitudes to morality, economics, and power than any sermon ever could. If you enjoyed this dive into the hidden side of the Middle Ages, subscribe to Forbidden History for more. In the next episodes, we'll look at how often medieval people really bathed, what strange medical treatments they trusted, and the bizarre punishments handed out for everyday crimes. Leave a comment with the question you'd like answered, and I'll see you in the next forbidden story from the past.